Before coffee became a morning habit, before it sat in paper cups on office desks, before it powered students through exams, soldiers through war, and workers through endless shifts, there was a time when people feared it enough to ban it. Not because it was poison, not because it killed instantly, but because coffee did something far more dangerous. It kept people awake, and when people stayed awake, they talked. They gathered in crowded rooms filled with smoke, heat, and the bitter smell of roasted beans. They argued about religion, money, kings, taxes, trade, and rebellion. In those rooms, a simple drink became more than a drink. It became fuel for ideas. Today, coffee feels ordinary, something millions of people reach for before they check their phones, start their cars, or walk into work. But hidden inside that dark liquid is a story of empire, slavery, revolution, capitalism, addiction, and control. Coffee did not just wake people up. It helped wake up the modern world. The story begins far from modern cafes, far from espresso machines, office towers, and drive-through windows. It begins in the highlands of Ethiopia, where coffee grew wild long before the world understood what it was. According to legend, a goat herder noticed something strange happening to his animals. After eating bright red berries from a certain plant, the goats became restless, energetic, almost impossible to control. They leaped across the hills as if the mountain itself had filled their bodies with fire. The story is probably more legend than documented fact, needs fact check, but it captures the first great mystery of coffee. This was not an ordinary plant. It did not fill the stomach like grain, or sweeten the tongue like fruit. It changed the body. It fought sleep. It sharpened attention. And in a world where human life still followed the sun, anything that could push back against exhaustion was not just useful, it was powerful. From Ethiopia, coffee eventually crossed the Red Sea into Yemen, where it began to take on a deeper human purpose. In the port city of Mocha, the strange berry was roasted, brewed, traded, and slowly transformed into something more powerful than a local curiosity. Sufi mystics are often linked to coffee's early rise because they used it to stay awake during long nights of prayer and devotion. For them, coffee was not a luxury or a fashion. It was a spiritual tool. It helped the body resist sleep when the night grew heavy. It kept the mind focused when exhaustion tried to pull it away from God. In a world before electric light, this was quietly revolutionary. Night was supposed to end human activity. Darkness closed markets, slowed streets, and pushed people into rest. But coffee gave people more hours, more prayer, more thought, more time awake. By the late 15th century, coffee drinking was already established among Sufi communities in Yemen. This is important because Ethiopia may have given coffee its biological origin, but Yemen helped give coffee its human form. In Yemen, coffee was cultivated, roasted, brewed, and connected to trade routes that carried it toward Mecca, Cairo, Damascus, and Constantinople. The drink was no longer just a mysterious berry. It was becoming a habit, a ritual, and a social technology. But whenever a drink gives people more time to stay awake, it also gives them more time to gather. And that is where coffee began to change, from a spiritual tool into a social force. As it spread through the Islamic world, coffee houses started appearing in cities like Mecca, Cairo, Damascus, and Istanbul. These were not quiet modern cafes where people sat alone behind laptops. They were crowded, smoky, restless rooms filled with voices. Men came to drink, argue, listen to poetry, hear news, play games, and debate the world around them. A merchant could bring rumors from the market. A traveler could carry news from another city. A scholar could challenge an old idea. A joke about a ruler could pass from one table to another until it became something sharper. Coffee had created a new kind of room, and inside that room, information moved faster than authority could control. These coffee houses became known as schools of the wise, and the name itself revealed why they mattered. For the price of a cup, people could enter a space where ideas were not locked behind palace walls, religious institutions, or elite circles. They could listen, question, laugh, argue, and learn. But to rulers, that kind of freedom was never harmless. A room full of awake men was different from a room full of drunk men. Alcohol could blur the mind and soften memory, but coffee sharpened it. It made people alert enough to notice injustice, focused enough to debate it, and energized enough to spread it. That was the real danger. Coffee did not make people lose control. It helped them gain control of their thoughts. And once ordinary people began thinking together, the drink in their hands became political, even when no one called it that yet. That is why coffee began to attract suspicion. In some cities, authorities worried that coffee houses were becoming more than places to drink. They were becoming places where public opinion could form. And public opinion was dangerous, because it did not belong to kings, judges, clerics, or soldiers. It belonged to the crowd. There were attempts to ban coffee, or shut down coffee houses, often under accusations that they encouraged disorder, immoral behavior, or rebellion. But the real fear was deeper than morality. Coffee created alert crowds. It gave people a reason to sit together for hours without becoming numb or silent. It turned private frustration into public conversation. A complaint whispered at one table could spread across the room. By morning, it could travel through the city. Coffee was not dangerous because it made people drunk. It was dangerous because it made them awake. When coffee reached Europe, it entered a continent that already had its own daily drugs. Beer, ale, and wine were part of ordinary life in many cities, partly because clean water was not always reliable. People drank alcohol at meals, in taverns, during business, and in public life. Then coffee arrived. Dark, bitter, foreign, and strange. To many Europeans, it looked suspicious from the beginning. Some saw it as a Muslim drink. Others thought it was unnatural, too stimulating, too exotic, too closely tied to cultures they feared or misunderstood. There were even religious questions about whether Christians should drink it at all. But coffee survived suspicion because it offered something Europe badly needed. It did not dull the mind like alcohol. It sharpened it. It did not slow conversation. It accelerated it. And in cities growing louder, richer, and more restless, that clarity became impossible to ignore. By the 1600s, coffee houses began spreading through European cities, and nowhere did they become more important than in London. For the price of a penny, a man could step inside, buy a cup of coffee, read newspapers, hear the latest gossip, meet merchants, debate politics, and discuss business with strangers. These places became known as penny universities because they gave ordinary people access to information that had once belonged mostly to the educated and powerful. Inside those rooms, the modern world was being assembled, one conversation at a time. Merchants compared shipping news. Investors listened for opportunity. Writers tested their ideas on live audiences. Scientists debated discoveries. Political arguments sharpened over steaming cups. Coffee houses were not just selling caffeine. They were selling access to news, to networks, to arguments, to ambition. And in a society changing faster every decade, access was power. One of London's most famous early coffee houses was opened in 1652 by Pasqua Rosé in St. Michael's Alley, near the Royal Exchange. That location mattered. Coffee entered London close to merchants, traders, shipping men, lawyers, and people hungry for information. It did not arrive as a quiet domestic drink. It arrived beside commerce. And from there, coffee houses multiplied into small engines of news, debate, beverages. Some of the institutions that shaped the modern world grew out of this coffeehouse culture, or at least were deeply connected to it. The clearest example was Lloyd's. Edward Lloyd's coffee shop near the River Thames became a center of marine intelligence, where shipowners, merchants, captains, and underwriters gathered for shipping news. In a world where one storm, one wreck, or one missing ship could destroy a fortune, information was everything. Over time, that coffeehouse culture helped form what became Lloyd's of London, one of the most famous insurance marketplaces in the world. Insurance deals were discussed over coffee. Newspapers passed from hand to hand. Shipping routes, commodity prices, political rumors, and business risks were debated in rooms where a man with the right information could make or lose a fortune. This was not the old world of power, flowing only from kings and landowners. It was a new world, where information itself became a kind of currency. Coffee houses helped create a public space that was not a church, not a royal court, and not a private home. It was something different, a room where people could gather as readers, customers, citizens, critics, and investors. And once that kind of space existed, it became almost impossible to fully control. That was exactly why coffee houses made rulers nervous. A king could control a court. A church could control a pulpit. A landlord could control an estate. But a crowded room full of merchants, writers, lawyers, sailors, and political talkers was harder to silence. In England, King Charles II became alarmed by coffee houses because they were seen as places where false news, criticism, and dangerous political conversations could spread. At one point, the government tried to suppress them, but the reaction was intense. By then, coffee houses had already become woven into the life of the city. People did not see them as a minor luxury anymore. They saw them as part of how information moved. Coffee had escaped the cup. It had become a network, and once a drink becomes a network, banning the drink is no longer enough to stop what it has awakened. One of London's most famous early coffee houses was opened in 1652 by Pasqua Rosé in St. Michael's Alley, near the Royal Exchange. That location mattered. Coffee entered London close to merchants, traders, shipping men, lawyers, and people hungry for information. It did not arrive as a quiet domestic drink. It arrived beside commerce, and from there, coffee houses multiplied into small engines of news, debate, beverages. But as coffee spread across Europe, its story began to move into darker territory. The more people wanted it, the more powerful men began asking a simple question: who controlled the plant? For a long time, Yemen held a valuable position in the coffee trade. Coffee could be exported, but fertile seeds and living plants were carefully protected, because whoever controlled the source controlled the supply. But European empires did not want to depend on distant ports, foreign merchants, or old trade routes. They wanted coffee under their own flag, on their own land, feeding their own markets. So the plant that had once moved through prayer, trade, and conversation now entered the age of smuggling, empire, and conquest. Coffee was no longer just something people drank in smoky rooms while talking about power. It had become something powerful nations were willing to steal, transplant, and exploit. Eventually, coffee plants were smuggled, transplanted, and forced into new colonial landscapes. The Dutch carried coffee to Java. The French helped spread it through the Caribbean. The Portuguese expanded it in Brazil. And wherever coffee went, the story became darker, because coffee did not become a global commodity through peaceful morning routines or charming cafe culture. It became global through empire, land seizure, forced labor, and plantation systems. In tropical colonies, the plant thrived in soil that Europeans wanted, but did not intend to work themselves. Forests were cleared. Local communities were pushed aside. Enslaved Africans and exploited laborers were forced into fields so that people thousands of miles away could drink something bitter, fashionable, and energizing. The cup in Europe depended on suffering far away. Coffee gave energy to the modern world, but that energy came with a hidden human cost. This is the part of coffee's history that modern cafes almost never show. Behind the polished counter, behind the soft lighting, behind the smell of roasted beans and warm milk, there is another image. Bodies bent under tropical heat, hands cutting through dense fields, forests disappearing, ships carrying wealth in one direction and pain in the other. Coffee became a drink of conversation, philosophy, and freedom in European cities, but much of it was produced by people who had very little freedom at all. That contradiction sits at the center of its rise. The same drink that helped men argue about liberty in coffee houses was tied to systems that denied liberty to millions. Coffee sharpened the mind of the modern world, but it also exposed one of that world's deepest hypocrisies. Progress for some people was often built on exhaustion, extraction, and silence for others. In the Caribbean and Latin America, coffee became part of a much larger machine that turned land, labor, and human suffering into profit. Plantations were not peaceful farms built around a harmless morning drink. They were systems of control. Land had to be taken or reshaped. Forests had to be cleared. Workers had to be forced, trapped, underpaid, or kept dependent on owners and exporters who controlled the value of the crop. In Brazil, Saint Domingue, Cuba, and other coffee-growing regions, the demand for coffee tied local lives to distant markets. A decision made in a European trading house could change the fate of people working under the sun, thousands of miles away. This was the brutal engine behind the elegant coffee house. The louder people in Europe talked about reason, freedom, and progress. The more coffee revealed the darker truth beneath modern civilization. Comfort in one place often required suffering somewhere else. And then, as the modern age moved toward revolution, coffee was already waiting on the table. In America, coffee gained a new symbolic meaning after tea became tied to British taxation and imperial control. For some colonists, choosing coffee was no longer just a matter of taste. It became a small act of defiance. Tea belonged to the empire. Coffee could feel like resistance. Across the Atlantic, in France, cafes became gathering places for writers, intellectuals, radicals, and restless citizens who were beginning to imagine a world without absolute monarchy. Inside those rooms, political language sharpened. People argued about rights, inequality, privilege, hunger, and power. Coffee did not cause the American Revolution or the French Revolution by itself. No drink can do that. But it gave people a place to gather, a reason to stay awake, and the fuel to keep dangerous conversations alive. That is what made coffee so important in the age of revolution. It was not magic. It did not put rebellion into people's minds by itself, but it changed the conditions around those minds. It created rooms where strangers could become political communities. It gave exhausted people the energy to stay in arguments longer than they normally would. It helped news travel through conversation before it reached official channels. In a cafe, a rumor could become a debate could become a belief, and a belief could become a movement. Authority had always depended on distance, silence, and delay. Coffee worked in the opposite direction. It shortened distance. It broke silence. It made delay harder. And, as the 18th century became more restless, that mattered. The world was beginning to move faster, and coffee was becoming one of the drinks that helped people keep up. And then came the industrial world. where coffee found perhaps its most powerful role yet. Factories did not care if the human body was tired. Offices did not care if the mind wanted rest. Railroads, newspapers, stock exchanges, shipping networks, and machines all belonged to a faster rhythm, one ruled less by sunrise and more by the clock. Coffee fit that world perfectly. It helped workers wake before dawn, clerks focus through long hours, soldiers stay alert, and managers demand more from bodies that were never designed to run like machines. In the old agricultural rhythm, people worked with daylight. In the industrial rhythm, people worked because the clock said so. Coffee became the drink that helped the human body obey that clock. It pushed sleep aside, made early mornings bearable, and turned exhaustion into something people could temporarily survive. The modern workday did not invent coffee, but coffee made the modern workday easier to survive. As cities grew larger and labor became more scheduled, people needed something that could force the body into motion before it was ready. Coffee became that answer. It entered factories, offices, train stations, military camps, newspaper rooms, and late-night businesses. It was no longer only the drink of mystics, merchants, and revolutionaries. It became the drink of people who had to keep going, even when they were exhausted. A cup of coffee before work, a refill during a break, another cup to finish the night shift. Slowly, coffee became tied to responsibility itself. To drink it was to admit that life demanded more energy than the body naturally had. It became the taste of discipline, pressure, ambition, and fatigue, the bitter flavor of a world that expected humans to move faster than ever before. By the 20th century, coffee had moved from the edges of history into the center of everyday life. It was poured in diners before sunrise, served to soldiers during war, brewed in office break rooms, carried by nurses through night shifts, and swallowed by students trying to stay awake before exams. It no longer belonged only to distant ports, political cafes, or colonial plantations. It belonged to ordinary exhaustion. In America especially, coffee became fused with the culture of work. A hot cup in the morning meant the day had begun. A refill meant there was still more to do. Black coffee, weak coffee, cheap coffee, military coffee, office coffee. Each version carried the same message: keep going. The world was faster now, louder, more demanding, and less forgiving of rest. Coffee became the small daily ritual that helped millions of people pretend they were not tired. Then coffee became even easier to consume. Instant coffee made it faster. Canned coffee made it portable. Drive-through coffee made it fit into the speed of commuting. And global coffee chains turned it into something more than caffeine. They turned it into identity. A cup was no longer just a cup. It became a personal order, a routine, a small statement about who someone was or wanted to be. Black coffee, espresso, cold brew, latte, oat milk, extra shot. Each choice made the drink feel intimate, customized, almost emotional. The cafe became a remote office, a meeting place, a quiet escape, and sometimes a stage where modern loneliness could sit beside modern ambition. What began as a bitter drink used by mystics to stay awake through prayer had become a global ritual, sold in branded paper cups. But the old contradictions never disappeared. Behind every polished cafe counter and every perfect morning order, coffee still begins in soil, weather, labor, and risk. Most of the world's coffee is grown in tropical regions, often by farmers who live far from the wealthy cities where the drink is most profitable. They plant, harvest, dry, sort, and sell the beans, but they do not always control the price. A consumer may pay several dollars for a single cup, while the people who grew the crop may struggle with unstable markets, rising costs, plant disease, and unpredictable weather. The modern coffee industry can make a drink feel personal and luxurious, but the supply chain behind it is often fragile and unequal. The world runs on coffee, yet the people who grow it do not always share in the wealth it creates. And now, coffee faces a threat that feels almost like history turning back on itself. The same modern world that coffee helped energize has created conditions that may make coffee harder to grow. Rising temperatures, shifting rainfall, extreme weather, and plant disease are putting pressure on coffee-growing regions across the world. A crop that depends on specific climates can become fragile when those climates begin to change. For farmers, this does not look like an abstract global problem. It looks like damaged harvests, lower yields, unstable income, and the fear that land their families depended on may no longer produce what it once did. For consumers, it may begin as higher prices or changing taste. But for growers, it can threaten an entire way of life. Coffee helped build a faster, more connected, more productive civilization. Now that civilization may be making coffee itself less secure. That is the strange part of coffee's story. For centuries, coffee helped people push beyond natural limits. It helped monks resist sleep, merchants chase profit, revolutionaries sharpen arguments, workers survive long shifts, and cities move faster than the human body was ever meant to move. It became the drink of acceleration. But acceleration always has a cost. The world coffee helped energize, became more industrial, more connected, more productive, and more demanding. It burned more fuel, moved more goods, cleared more land, expanded more markets, and asked more from both people and nature. Now the plant that once seemed powerful enough to change civilization is vulnerable to the civilization it helped create. Coffee gave humans more waking hours. It helped build a world that never wants to slow down. And now that restless world may be pushing coffee toward an uncertain future. Still, every morning, the ritual continues. Somewhere, before sunrise, a machine hisses in a kitchen. A paper cup is handed through a drive-through window. A barista calls out a name in a crowded cafe. A tired parent stands beside the counter, waiting for the first sip to make the day feel possible. A student opens a laptop beside a half-empty mug. An office worker walks into another meeting, with coffee in one hand and exhaustion hidden behind their face. Most people do not think about Yemen, Ethiopia, colonial plantations, banned coffee houses, revolutions, or climate-threatened farms when they drink it. They only think about waking up. And maybe that is coffee's greatest disguise. After everything it has survived, and everything it has shaped, it still presents itself as something small, private, and ordinary. Just a cup, just a habit, just the beginning of another day. Coffee seems small, because we meet it in small moments. A mug on a desk, a cup holder in a car, a paper cup carried down a crowded street. But its history has never been small. It survived religious suspicion, political bans, imperial theft, plantation violence, revolutionary debate, industrial exhaustion, and global capitalism. It traveled from mountain berries to sacred rituals, from smoky coffee houses to colonial fields, from diner counters to corporate chains, from the hands of farmers to the screens of remote workers, using cafes as offices. Again and again, coffee appeared wherever the world was changing speed. When people needed to pray longer, it was there. When they needed to argue against kings, it was there. When empires wanted profit, it was there. When factories demanded alert bodies, it was there. Coffee did not simply follow modern history. In quiet, bitter, ordinary ways, it helped push that history forward. That is why coffee is so easy to underestimate. It does not look like a weapon, a machine, a law, or an empire. It sits quietly in front of us, dark and warm, wrapped in routine. But for centuries, it has been tied to the things that reshape human life: wakefulness, conversation, labor, trade, control, and desire. Coffee made people alert enough to pray through the night, argue through the afternoon, work before sunrise, and think beyond the limits of the world they inherited. It helped build rooms where ideas could gather before they became movements. It helped feed markets that stretched across oceans. It helped teach modern people to treat exhaustion as normal and productivity as identity. And perhaps that is its most unsettling power. Coffee does not force history forward with violence. It does something quieter. It keeps people awake long enough to change it. In that sense, coffee is not just a drink, it is a mirror. It reflects the best and worst parts of the modern world at the same time. It shows our hunger for knowledge, but also our willingness to turn that hunger into profit. It shows our desire for freedom, but also the systems of labor and empire that made freedom comfortable for some and impossible for others. It shows our ambition, our creativity, our conversations, our revolutions, and our addiction to doing more than the body can naturally bear. Every cup carries that contradiction. It can feel warm, personal, and harmless in one hand, while behind it stands a history of control, extraction, resistance, and survival. Coffee became powerful because it met one of humanity's oldest weaknesses. We get tired, and then it turned that weakness into a global system. So the next time someone lifts a cup of coffee, they are not just drinking caffeine, they are touching a long chain of human history. Somewhere behind that cup is a mountain plant that once seemed mysterious, a port city that turned it into trade, a mystic who used it to fight sleep, a ruler who feared the conversations it created, a merchant who saw profit in its beans, a worker who harvested it under brutal conditions, a revolutionary who argued beside it, a factory worker who depended on it, and a modern consumer who drinks it without thinking about any of them. That is what makes coffee so strange. It hides enormous history inside an ordinary habit. It looks like comfort, but it carries conflict. It tastes like routine, but it was built through disruption. It feels personal, but it has always belonged to the world. And maybe that is why coffee still feels so powerful today. It gives the illusion of control. One cup and the morning feels less heavy. Another cup and the deadline feels possible. Another cup and the tired body is told to keep moving. But behind that private feeling is a much larger story about how the modern world learned to fight sleep, speed up work, spread ideas, and turn even exhaustion into an industry. Coffee woke up monks, worried kings, fueled traders, crossed oceans, fed empires, sharpened revolutions, powered factories, and filled the hands of people who had no choice but to keep going. It has been treated as sacred, suspicious, fashionable, patriotic, profitable, addictive, and necessary. Few things so ordinary have touched so many parts of human history. And few things so small have helped make the world feel so restless. Coffee did not conquer the world by looking powerful. It conquered the world by becoming necessary. It entered the body quietly, then entered religion, trade, politics, labor, empire, rebellion, business, and daily life. It gave people more hours, more focus, more conversation, and more pressure to keep moving. It helped build public spaces where ideas could spread, colonial systems where wealth could be extracted, factories where exhaustion could be managed, and modern routines where productivity became almost a moral duty. Today, it still sits in front of us, pretending to be simple. A dark liquid in a cup, a smell in the morning, a habit we barely question. But behind it is one of the strangest stories in human history. a small, bitter bean that woke up the world, then taught the world to never fully sleep again.